you have your perspective, because here in Poland, here in Europe, due to the Ukrainian war, we are starting to talk that China will invade Taiwan, China will do a war, prepare, and we will have another issue on the not only Hamas, not only Donbass, but also Taipei. We have new Chinese ambition, assertive China, being it Belt and Road Initiative, being it competition in space, being the Taiwan issue, being a competition for semiconductors and so on and so forth. So when Xi Jinping came out with his idea of Chinese Renaissance, America wake up and we have a strategic competition.
So, I mean, all these people who talk about why China is not listening to Deng Xiaoping, I can tell you one thing. Deng Xiaoping was one of the wisest, shrewdest men that China has ever produced. I guarantee you, in 2024, Deng Xiaoping would say, we are now an elephant. We are not a mouse. So we must therefore get ready for the new reality of this China. And at the end of the day, remember, you and I can wish for a different world. But I can tell you that when you come from smaller countries, we cannot live according to our wishes. We have to live according to the realities.
我们刚刚听到的是2024年2月，新加坡资深外交家马凯硕与3位波兰学者交锋的一个片段。在今天的欧洲，尤其是像波兰这样的前线国家，对中国的认知似乎完全被西方主流媒体所塑造，充满了偏见、误解，甚至是一丝不易察觉的文化优越感。在接下来的内容中，你将看到一场教科书级别的思想纠偏。面对波兰学者关于中国内部变化以及台湾问题的一系列典型西方化提问，马凯硕是如何用一个亚洲视角系统性的将其一一驳斥。他将用老鼠与大象这个生动的比喻，为中国为何不再韬光养晦做出最精辟的解释。更重要的是，在台湾问题上，他将彻底颠覆西方的战争叙事，并用熟透的果实来预言其最终结局。这是一堂在欧洲腹地给西方精英们上的中国国情课。让我们继续看下去。
We can say that one of China's biggest weaknesses is its sinocentrism, its Middle Kingdom complex. And now, when we look at Russia-China relations, we can see that China was able to restrain itself. But when we look at China's relations with others, it's not so. Since Professor Mahbubani is in Singapore 14 years ago, there was a famous quote by Yang Jiechi, who said in Singapore, no, it was in Hanoi, but it was a reply to Singaporean foreign minister, that China is a big country and ASEAN countries are small countries, and this is a fact. So by this kind of actions, this reveals sinocentrism, and this is one of China's biggest weakness. So far they were able to manage that, to handle that in relations with Russia, but not necessarily with other countries. And as for disruption, as for Krzysztof's question, I believe that the way Russia disrupts is in a way it's in a way beneficial to China's interests, long-term interests, because Russia disrupts the Western world. It disrupts in Europe. It tests Europe. It sometimes the outcomes are not necessarily the one Beijing might wish to see, but nevertheless, Russia is challenging a common foe of China, and in this regard, these disruptions are not necessarily that detrimental to China's interests. So, in a way, it pays for China to have this spoiler, to have Russia as the spoiler, because then Russia can do many things which China doesn't want to do or which is unwilling to do in public. So in this regard, there is a sort of entente between China and Russia, and it's certainly not based on love, but it's based on mutual understanding and very strategic objectives. So in this regard, I believe that while these disruptions are not that negative for China.
If I can just address this question directly to Professor Mahbubani, because I think it's very interesting. Because to be honest, in the discourse in Poland and in the West, Iran and Russia are portrayed very frequently now as a kind of Chinese proxies. Are they? Are they Chinese proxies?
Well, I think China will be very happy if Russia and Iran were Chinese proxies. But I think the Chinese are the ultimate. You were talking of Mearsheimer and geopolitical realism. The ultimate realists of any country in the world are the Chinese. And by the way, this is an insight I got actually from Henry Kissinger. You know, I had two one-on-one conversations with him. One in October 2018 when I was writing my book on Has China Won. Then I saw him again in October 2022, about 1 year before he died. And again, he reiterated his views on China, which you can get, by the way. His book, which is called On China, is wonderful. I would recommend every Polish citizen to read it, because if they want to understand China, they should read Kissinger's book on China. And he explains how... And you should understand that, yeah. You know, the Chinese always take the long view. You know, they're not interested in what happens next month or next year. At the earliest, they're thinking, what will the world be like 10 years from now? Or what will the world be like 100 years from now? And so, you know, that's why when lots, I'll give you a contemporary example. Everyone says, you know, China has peaked, the China growth story is over, China is having lots of problems. Yes, it's having a lot of problems. But I'll take a bet with any of you that 10 years from now, China's economy will be much bigger. It hasn't stopped growing, right? Even though the Anglo-Saxon media thinks it has continued to grow. So I can tell you that from the Chinese point of view, if you want to understand the Chinese mind, the most important thing to remember is that the Chinese mind is conditioned by 4,000 years of Chinese history. Now, in 4,000 years of Chinese history, what is genetically embedded in their civilization is the realization that Chinese people do best when there's law and order and stability. Chinese people suffer when there's chaos, what they call luan. And so the Chinese hate chaos. So, you know, if this is why the conclusion of my book, Has China Won? If the United States can come with a sort of a geopolitical global framework that says, hey, okay, let's agree on a common set of rules. You can do well, we can do well, but let's agree on these rules. And if you offer any package deal to the Chinese that emphasizes stability, predictability, and order, they'll take it. They're not interested in having proxies like Russia or Iran or so on and so forth. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the Chinese will work with everybody. And that's why, as you know, China engineered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, if Iran is their proxy, why are they linking Iran with Saudi Arabia? No, what they want is calm, stability, because China is also, as you know, now the world's largest trading power. And, you know, when the Houthis close the Red Sea channels, who suffers? Chinese suffer. There are more exports going through the Red Sea channel than United States does, right? So clearly the Chinese, if you give them a package deal that emphasizes predictability and stability, they will work with it. They will accept it. But you see, the reason why this is not possible yet, and this is why I say this very sadly, the United States is so focused on keeping China down that it doesn't focus on how to cooperate with China. And I think that, and by the way, I can tell you privately that Henry Kissinger agrees with me that what the United States needs is a long-term comprehensive strategy on what you want to achieve with China. Because today, what is unclear is that the United States is obviously taking all kinds of actions against China, tariffs on Chinese trade, suspension of chip exports, suspension of chip technology. But what's your end goal? What do you want to achieve? Are you going to try and get the Chinese Communist Party to collapse like the Soviet Communist Party? Maybe it can be done, but it cannot be done. I can assure you it cannot be done. So in fact, and paradoxically, the more pressure the United States puts on China and the Chinese Communist Party, the stronger China becomes. That's the paradox.
So before I give the voice to Professor Guralczyk, one clarification, because I think it's crucial to understand Chinese politics. Me personally, I cannot understand if Chinese is so focused on trade, why they are so passive in the crisis in the Middle East? Why they are not trying to make the trade route via Red Sea and Suez operational again? Why there is a Chinese base in Djibouti?
I can tell you very simply, the Chinese are the ultimate geopolitical realists, which means they know what they can do and they know what they cannot do. And they know they cannot. They understand the complexity of the Middle East very well. And so the best they can do, as you know, is to try and persuade the Houthis, don't shoot Chinese ships. And I mean, that they can accomplish. But trying to persuade the Houthis to stop shooting, they can't do it. And the Chinese, by the way, don't like to engage in military interventions. As you know, the United States often believes that the best solution is to either impose sanctions or bomb a country. And the Chinese don't believe in that. And the Chinese believe that you've got to try and find a pragmatic solution for all the challenges that you have. So, for example, as you know, China has a lot of challenges with Japan, huge challenges with Japan. But at the end of the day, they always find ways and means of working with each other quietly. Behind the scenes, something is worked out, and they continue. So that's what China will try to do. And since the Chinese government doesn't have to worry about elections, it doesn't have to worry about the headlines in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it does what it thinks is the right thing for it over the long term, and not worry about what the next headline will say.
Professor Guralczyk, your intervention.
Yes, until now we are in harmony. Time to arrange something of a kind of disharmony between us to be more entertaining. Professor Mahbubani, please make a statement after my intervention, what you think about what will be said. To my mind, we observe right now three another major shifts on the global scale. One was already raised by Michał Lubina. It is concerning China-Russian relations. You usually describe this relation in one Chinese proverb and sentence. They are sleeping in one bed, but have different dreams. So this is the explanation. No trust. However, there is a power shift there, because until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was Russia, later Soviet Union, as a big brother to Xiaohongdi, to smaller brother in China. Now is vice versa. For how long? This is a major geopolitical question. And I suppose after Ukrainian war, after Mr. Putin, it will be top political issue on the global scale. And this is shift number one. Shift number two, which complicates our debate and also has another dimension towards the issue, has China won, is this geopolitical strategic change in American attitude towards China. Since Kissinger and Nixon opening for some 5 almost decades, we had the engagement. Instead of engagement, we have harsh, not even, but very harsh strategic competition and bipartisan in the US case. It was inaugurated during the Trump administration, is continued during the Biden administration. Of course, we had San Francisco summit, ceasefire, if I may so, for American election, but this is a structural clash. To give it a strap, if you wish. This is why situation and the image of China in the Western world, in the global, to some extent, also in the global scene, has changed. And it is proved in public opinion polls. And this shift number 3, concerning China itself. I happened to be in China as the first Polish student out of 2 in the academic year 1979-1980, the first one after the Cultural Revolution. So I do remember, as you do, from 1980, that everyone was bicycling, no one was even dreaming about the car. And right now, when I was in last November, just few months ago, completely different planet, not a different country. However, in this different planet, I would raise one issue, which is Deng Xiaoping heritage. Deng Xiaoping in August 1980 had a speech during the Political Bureau meeting, which was crucial. He was strongly attacking bureaucracy, the party. He was against one-man rule. He was against engagement of the party into the production and market forces and so on and so forth. Very, very harsh words, which were valid for 1980s. And secondly, and you mentioned that in your previous book, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he used this constitution of 28 Chinese characters, 韬光养晦, bide your time, conceal your capabilities, and avoid the limelight. And it was a Chinese strategy for 20 years, but not anymore. What has changed since Deng Xiaoping during the Xi Jinping era? New era, they say. First, Americans, Joe Biden says, America is back. In China, party is back. This is point number 1. Point number 2, one-man rule is back against the will of Deng Xiaoping. Point number 3, Deng Xiaoping, it was 实事求是, seek truth from facts, pragmatism, realism, as you say, ultimate sophisticated realists. But right now we have more and more ideology, including Marxism. And Marxism, by definition, is against market. So we have those issues on the top of the agenda. When you go right now to the bookstore in Beijing or Shanghai, you will see more Mao than Deng Xiaoping. This is something which is troubling. And finally, the most important thing. Instead of previous low profile, we have new Chinese ambition, assertive China, being it Belt and Road Initiative, being it competition in space, being the Taiwan issue, being a competition for semiconductors and so on and so forth. So when Xi Jinping came out with his idea of Chinese Renaissance, America wake up and we have a strategic competition. So this is something which is complicating this current situation surrounding China. Absolutely, I agree, however, with your statement that they are ultimate realists. One important issue to be raised during our debate. Even during the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards didn't go to atomic bomb, thermonuclear nukes, which were exploded during the Cultural Revolution. So the interests of empire, fundamental interest. America says, well, let's make America again. Since Sun Yat-sen, through Chiang Kai-shek, through Mao Zedong, until Xi Jinping, they will say, let's make China big again. And that's why we have a problem, we have a headache, because the hegemonic power is clashing with the aspirant to be hegemonic power different way.
So, Professor Mahbubani, if you can just respond, is this vision of make America great again and make China great again to be negotiated?
Well, I can tell you that Bogdan made lots of points, other points than that. On the first point, when you talk about Russia and China, in your first point, I think I want to go back to a point that Michal made when he spoke about the yellow peril.
Yeah.
And I hope that my Polish friends will pay attention to this phrase, yellow peril, because that's an emotional dimension in international affairs too. And one of the things that's driving, in some ways, the United States geopolitical contests against China is the fear of the yellow peril, which I document in my book. And also, frankly, I think in Russia, there's an even greater fear of the yellow peril because Russians were actually invaded by the yellow peril. So
they have hidden it. They have concealed it. They have concealed it because they have buried their anxieties. That's quite important.
Yeah. You're right. They've completely, but it's real. And I think it's important for us, if you want to understand the complexity of our world today, we have to understand that there are deep wells of history in different parts of the world. We must understand the wells of history if we want to understand what's happening today. Because whatever is happening today is not just because of what you and I are saying today. It's about what happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So, for example, in the case of China, the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949, none of us have mentioned it so far. That is the number one psychological driving force in Chinese minds. And you must understand the century of humiliation if you want to understand why China acts the way it does. And why did Deng Xiaoping have the 28 characters that Bogdan referred to, take a low profile, don't exhibit yourself and so on and so forth, because he wanted China to focus on growth and become strong. And Bogdan asked the question, why has China switched from, taking a low profile and becoming more assertive? Well, as I want to give you one statistic. In 1990, China's GNP, and by the way, just as an aside, let me mention, The Economist said in 1990, China's growth is over. 1990, the magazine. At that time, China's GNP was $360 billion. China's growth, the Economist said, growth story is over. And Deng Xiaoping said, take a low profile. Now, last year, China's GNP is now almost 18 trillion. It's gone up 50 times. Now, it's easy for a mouse to take a low profile. The mouse can hide under the table and people don't notice it. Now China is an elephant. Elephants cannot hide under the table. There's no table big enough to hide an elephant. So China, obviously, when it becomes 50 times bigger, it's not going to behave like a mouse. And by the way, all the Asian neighbors of China understand that. If you live with a mouse, you behave in a certain way. if you live with an elephant, you behave a different way. Because when the elephant is sleeping and it rolls over, it can kill you. So you have to deal differently. And so it is unrealistic to expect that China will not become more assertive, will not throw its weight around as an elephant. But I want to emphasize that in English, there's a huge difference between two English words. And actually, I wrote a column in the Financial Times about this. One is assertive, the other is aggressive. China has become much more assertive. I completely agree, Bogdan. I mean, you're big, you don't expect, if people don't treat you right. I can tell you, by the way, honestly, it's a true simple story. When I was in Singapore as a member of the UN Security Council, we went to visit 15 African countries in a chartered United Nations plane, right? And we arrived in the capitals. And of course, we discovered as members of the Security Council that the 5 permanent members were given special treatment. 10 elected members were not given special treatment. 5 permanent members were always seated with the VIPs, the post-government. One place we went to, I forget which country, African country, they made a mistake. They only put 4 at the head table, United States, Russia, UK, France, and they put China at the side table. I tell you, the Chinese ambassador went ballistic. What is this? I should be at that table. I'm China. I'm now number 1. And of course, I mean, it's fair. He's no longer a mouse. Come on. So, I mean, all these people who talk about why China is not listening to Deng Xiaoping, I can tell you one thing. Deng Xiaoping was one of the wisest, shrewdest men that China has ever produced. I guarantee you, in 2024, Deng Xiaoping would say, we are now an elephant. We are not a mouse. So we must therefore get ready for the new reality of this China. And at the end of the day, remember, you and I can wish for a different world. But I can tell you that when you come from smaller countries, we cannot live according to our wishes. We have to live according to the realities. And that's what we have to deal with.
Talking about the elephants, because China is the elephant. I absolutely agree. However, if the elephant, China has the Taiwan issue open. When you are raising, quite rightly so, the 100 years of humiliation, like it or not, Taiwan issue is part of it. It is in Chinese psyche. Even in elementary schools, they are taught by one sentence: China is Taiwan is a part of China. Yes. So, do you have your perspective? Because here in Poland, here in Europe, due to the Ukrainian war, we are starting to talk that China will invade Taiwan, China will do a war, prepare, and we will have another issue on the not only Hamas, not only Donbass, but also Taipei. This is the issue which is discussed here sharply, and I would like to hear your perspective from Southeast Asia, which is more sensitive, closer, and you observe it. Talking about the elephants, we cannot escape the Taiwan issue, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, as you know, Taiwan today is the last living symbol of the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949, because, as you know, Taiwan was first separated from China when China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So for them, the separation of Taiwan is a memory of the Sino-Japanese War, and which is why, as you know, at the end of World War II, the Allies, I want to emphasize is the Allies, United States, Soviet Union, UK, France, all agreed that Taiwan belonged to China in 1945. People forget this point of history. And of course, as a result of the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, and so Taiwan was physically separated. Now, clearly, if I can assure you one thing, if the Taiwanese government declares independence, China will declare war. That's 100% certainty. But if the Taiwanese government is smart and doesn't declare independence, and I think they're not likely to declare independence, then China will not declare war. Because, in the case of the Chinese, and this is where you have to go back to Kissinger's book on China, the Chinese are thinking long-term. Where will I be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? And where will Taiwan be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? China's position in the world will keep going up and up and up. More and more countries around the world are going to trade with China and be dependent on China. Now, all these countries, you ask them, you got to choose between China and Taiwan. They say, of course, I choose China. Why would I choose Taiwan? And so Taiwan will fall like a ripe fruit onto the lap of the Chinese in due course. But of course, if you have very dangerous people, and as you know, one dangerous person is someone like the former Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, gave a speech publicly. I'm not inventing this. He said, United States should recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now that's a declaration of war. So we need a lot of wisdom in this world to prevent wars. And I must give you all a very important statistic. That the amazing thing about East Asia, and in fact South Asia too, is that in our region, there has been no major war in 44 years since the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, right? As you know, but Europe has had the Balkans War, the Ukraine War, and so on and so forth. So I think it's time for Europeans to reflect. Why is it that there are no wars in East Asia, but there's so many wars around Europe?
Yeah, I would just pose the question, which is after Taiwan, if the Chinese reunification would be full, I think the South China Sea and Northern India give some different perspective on this, because Taiwan is not the only part of the world with China's claim. But I would like to give the floor to Michał, who has his intervention.
Yes, I would like to, first of all, because since we should discuss about the book, but before I move back to the book, I would like to focus on Professor Mahbubani's words about no major wars in Southeast Asia, which I generally agree, but there is one exception, and this is Myanmar or Burma, because there has been a civil war in Myanmar since the very beginning of this country, and it's quite hidden it's not that well known outside of the country. Now we know after 2021 because it intensified, but the war has never stopped. So there was a war, and there has been a war continuing there, and as you remember quite well, Burma used to be called the Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia. So the comparison with Yugoslavia here is quite telling, and we'll see whether it will end up that way. But with that exception, I agree with the fact that Southeast Asia, after Americans quitted the region in 1975, which you write in the book, that's one of those selling points in this book, at least for Polish audience, because this is counterintuitive, that if America is no longer intervening in a region, then this region prospers. So this is one of the biggest assets for Polish readers, that this counterintuitive ideas would be there. However, I have one question or maybe hesitancy, and it's about Taiwan. Because the question is on whose side time is there. Because on one hand, like seeing from outside, I couldn't agree more with the fact that China will be more important, more influential, and so on and so on. That's clear. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that China is losing the battle for the minds of the Taiwanese, that the Taiwanese are getting much more distance towards China. There is developing self-identity. Some even say that a new nation is being born. And well, the status quo for now is beneficial for Taiwan because it exists. So the question is that it will be China who will have to change the status quo this way or another. Since their policy of bringing or influencing Taiwan softly has failed to many extent, because DPP has won a third election in a row now in terms of presidential elections. So how do you, Professor, how do you look at that with this variable of Taiwan and Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese people, because this is in a way also a small nation?
Well, I mean, firstly, on Burma, you're absolutely right. There is a civil war going on in Burma. But I was referring to what I call interstate wars rather than civil wars. Because, there are always civil disturbances in every country, and they've been there, and that's a normal thing. But may there be no interstate war between two major interstate wars since 1979. And that's quite remarkable in a region full of lots of divisions. Now, on the question of whose side time is on, now you're absolutely right. The Taiwanese people do not want to become part of China today. That's very, very clear. You're absolutely right. But at the same time, don't forget that if the Chinese were going to have a maximalist demand and say that Taiwan should incorporate itself and become completely like China, and the Taiwanese people must change all their lifestyles and accept the Chinese Communist Party and so on and so forth, then I think that's a problem. But there have been lots of incredible number of signals from China that indicate that if Taiwan is prepared to indicate that it believes in one China, China is prepared to give the Taiwanese people all the autonomy they want to lead exactly the lifestyles that they have, travel around the world, choose their local government, do what they want to do, but say we are part of China. That's all. So all you need, frankly, what's amazing about the Taiwanese problem is that it is not difficult to solve. Not difficult to solve at all. Because the Chinese government doesn't need to have Chinese troops in Taiwan, Chinese police in Taiwan, doesn't need all that. It just wants to say, okay, you accept you're part of China. You can't join us now. Never mind. But you say you're part of China and we will discuss when you can join. We can wait 100 years. So if that's the case, then there can be a solution.
But there's a third partner. We have not only two to tango, Taipei and Beijing. We have America, United States, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is a description of Taiwan by the Americans. So it is a much more complicated issue.
Oh, I agree. But I want you to know that the most separatist leader of Taiwan was somebody called Chen Shui-bian. And in the year 2003, Chen Shui-bian wanted to organize a referendum of the Taiwanese people to ask them, hey, would you like to be independent or would you like to be part of China? So he wanted to prove that the Taiwanese people wanted to be independent. And you know who stopped the referendum? It wasn't Beijing.
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush.
Of course.
I want to tell you this. The Americans can be very pragmatic. In theory, the Americans love democracy. And they should have told Chen Shui-bian, we love you. Please let the people, let the people of Taiwan choose democratically. And George W. Bush, I can tell you, put incredible amount of pressure on Chen Shui-bian. Incredible. Because at that time, the United States needed China very badly after the American invasion of Iraq. And this is what all great powers do. They never put their values first. They put their interests first. And so today, it may be in the interest of the United States to push for Taiwanese independence. I don't know, but it meant to be fair. Joe Biden, one reason why this year, I can tell your audience that in the year 2024, relations between US and China will be relatively speaking calm, okay? because at the last meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in San Francisco, there was a very good meeting. And I understand that President Joe Biden gave a very categorical assurance to Xi Jinping that he supports a one China policy. And as long as the United States supports a one China policy, there'll be no war.
我们刚刚看过的是一场来自东方的常识普及课。面对波兰学者们提出的充满西方叙事框架的种种问题，马凯硕先生以其一贯的坦率与深刻，给出了一个更接近真相的亚洲视角。在这场交锋中，他清晰地展示了两种世界观的巨大差异。在回应中国为何不再韬光养晦时，他用老鼠与大象的比喻，辛辣地指出，当一个国家体量增长了50倍之后，要求他继续像老鼠一样躲藏，这本身就是一种荒谬。在台湾问题上，他更是直接釜底抽薪。他不仅揭示了台独是美国可以随时拿来交易的筹码，更从一个长远的历史维度判断，只要台湾不主动越过红线，随着中国实力的不断增强，台湾问题最终会像熟透的果实一样和平解决。这场对话像一面镜子，照出了西方，尤其是东欧在认知中国时的种种偏见与无知。它也留给我们几个更具现实意义的问题来思考。第一，当一个国家的精英其对世界的认知完全来自于另一套话语体系时，他们做出的战略判断有多大可能真正符合自己的国家利益？第二，西方世界对黄祸论的深层恐惧，是否才是其当下所有对华非理性政策的真正根源？第三，关于台湾的最终结局，你认为会像马凯硕所预测的那样，随着时间推移和平解决，还是最终必须通过武力统一？我们期待在评论区听到你的想法。如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享并订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。